Whew. Brilliant. Well, I hope you are able to stick with that as we approach Corinth with Paul. I don't know how many of you have, how well you know Corinthians, or how many times you've read it, or whether you've studied it or not, but it's so worth it. Such an important letter in the New Testament. So we're going to follow Paul's footsteps from Athens, which is the previous chapter, to Corinth. And as we heard in the video, it was refounded following its destruction in the 3rd century BC. It was refounded by Julius Caesar in the year of his death, actually, in 46 BC. So Paul was there in AD 51. That's 1,970 years ago this summer. Isn't that amazing? Our 1 Corinthians is in fact 2 Corinthians. Paul says that he had already written to this energetic and volatile church a previous letter in 1 Corinthians 5 verse 9, if you want to check it out, when he said, "I had previously written to you." And this church consumed a lot of Paul's time and a lot of his energy and a lot of his theological acumen, not to mention exhausting his patience. Because the gospel of Jesus Christ was being profoundly applied to this decadent, immoral, idolatrous city. Quite something. So in any case, after Paul leaves Athens, he travels to Corinth. Now that sounds quite simple and straightforward. Athens is about 84 kilometers away, but in the context of Paul's traveling, it's nothing. Just 84 kilometers south from Athens to Corinth. If Athens was important for the gospel, Corinth is more important for the gospel. How so? We make much of Paul in Athens in Acts 17, especially when it comes to cross-cultural evangelism tactics, right? Acts 17 is often the go-to text for cross-cultural mission and ministry. And in Acts 17, Paul had observed all their gods to everything under the sun, and he also noticed, just in case they needed to cover all their bets, an altar to the unknown God. And that was Paul's cue to exploit the gospel of Jesus Christ in Athens, Acts 17, verse 22, and the following verses. So all this is well and good for now. Go to any large, cosmopolitan, multicultural city today, and it's the same deal. Paul in Athens, as an intellectual, and he was in his comfort zone. He probably loved being there until he got the response that he got. He was in his element. Athens, that place of ideas, of philosophy, of discussion, of debates. Athens, the city that housed Plato's Academy and Aristotle's Institute. Athens, the city of Apollo. What is Apollo like? Chiseled perfection, order, power, strong, control. It's all good stuff, of course, for a healthy society to have those things. So influential that Western societies today are built on the ideas that came out of Athens. Most of us, whether we know it or not, actually think in Platonic terms. We are children, in that sense, of the Athens philosophical culture. But look at chapter 17, verse 32, which wasn't read just now. But notice the response that Paul got. Some people mocked him, some people listened, some people believed. Now that's what we call a mixed reception, a lacklustre response. Paul may be in his intellectual element, but he may be enjoying the social life of Athens too. Like Paris, coffee shops on every corner, libraries, discussion groups, people musing about the meaning of things. But the response he got in Athens was not what he was used to. Almost everywhere else Paul had been to, what happened? Riots, stoning, beating, charges, arrest, smuggling out, fear. Almost everywhere else. But in Athens, what did they do? They ask him if he wants 1 lump or 2 with his coffee and croissants. It's not usual for Paul to be in this situation. So Paul went on 3 missionary journeys, if we can just pause a moment. He went on 3 missionary journeys after his conversion. The first missionary journey, Acts 13 and 14 in Asia Minor, the Galatian churches, modern-day Turkey. Those missionary trips triggered the Jerusalem Council of Acts 15. Acts 15 asked the question, should Gentiles become Christians without first becoming Jews? The Jerusalem Council finally and rightly decided no, they don't have to be circumcised, they don't have to follow the law of Moses, they just have to follow Christ in believing, trusting faith. That fueled Paul's second missionary journey, which is the one that we're in now. Athens, Corinth, Acts 15 to 18. And then, of course, his third missionary journey, Acts 18, 24 to chapter 20, verse 38. Okay, that sets the scene for the 3 journeys. We're in the second one now. Athens was an evangelistic masterclass for sure. But as we know, Paul was a restless sausage, right? Chapter 18, verse 1 says, after this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. Corinth was just too important a place in the Roman Empire to miss out. One of the largest cities in the empire, one of the wealthiest cities in the empire, one of the most strategic cities in the empire. But to go to Corinth from Athens, the price was very, very high. Paul writes in chapter 2, verse 3 of 1 Corinthians, I came to you, the Apostle Paul now, I came to you in weakness and fear and much trembling. I don't think he wrote that about anywhere else. Why was that? Paul was a soldier of Christ, a warrior of the gospel. He was fearless. He was unstoppable. He knew what he believed, and he knew in whom he believed, the Lord Jesus Christ. But he was afraid. And it was the city of Corinth that made him afraid. Why? Paul was leaving his intellectual comfort zone. He was probably alone in Athens. He was definitely alone in Corinth. What a place to be alone. Athens, of course, was famous for ideas of thought and philosophy and culture, of order. Corinth was the exact opposite in so many ways. It was famous for debauchery and wild living and sexual depravity and every vice under the sun. Its ruling mantra was chaos, at least for the human being, at least. Chaos, completely the opposite culture to Athens. As we saw from the maps, Corinth has got 2 ports. It's called Two-Seed Corinth, which enabled vast wealth to flow through the city. And of course, with every port town comes every vice with it, but for Corinth, every vice times 10, times 100. It was a city of such evil depravity that these depraved acts were celebrated as heroic virtues, a complete subversion of everything moral and righteous. Everything was linked, of course, to this vast trade that came through and gave it such an incredible economy. So if Athens had Apollos, and Corinth had Apollos too, one of the temples that still survives have 7 pillars at the temple of Apollos. It still survives. They had multiple gods, of course. But the main god of Athens was Apollos, the chiseled perfection, the strong one, the ordered one, the one in control, the powerful one. But going to Corinth, completely different story. The ruling god, Dionysus, he was wild looking. He had unkempt hair. He had a disordered manner on his face. He was disheveled. He was the god of orgies and drunkenness. And to reach communion with this god, You had to engage in drunken sexual chaos to achieve mystic communion with the gods. And I'm saying the word communion very deliberately. For when we come to chapter 11, the Corinthians brought this chaos into the life of the church because they were so saturated in their culture. Now, both Athens, as I said, and Corinth had many other gods, and temples were everywhere, on all the corners, all the street corners. But these two gods defined the nature and the character of the two cities that they inhabited. In Corinth, one could do nothing without a religious transaction. Nothing. And that religious transaction almost always, pretty much always, involves something to do with some form of disordered ritual religious transaction. Which is why one of the chief vices within the Corinthian church was sexual immorality. The very first thing that Paul addresses in their letter to him is incest. It's why Paul writes about the body in his letter as a unified thing, as a holy thing, the body as a temple of the Holy Spirit. There's nothing wrong with the human body. In fact, Paul gives it a dignity that is worthy of the gospel of Christ, a dignity that is given because of the gospel of Christ. Quite something. And I've not even told you the half of it yet. You're not going to get the second half today, of course, because time's always against us. But I've not even said the half of it. It's enough to make your skin crawl in many ways. Put simply, though, I think the best comparison would be Vegas. Are you familiar with the slogan that comes out of Vegas, Las Vegas? Anyone been to Las Vegas? You know the phrase? Okay, Richard, yes, all right, we need to pray for you, man. Whatever happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, right, Rich? Is that true? So, that's the slogan. Whatever happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Whatever happens in Corinth stays in Corinth. And it's a euphemism, it's a figure of speech. Whatever happens in Vegas stays in Vegas means we were so depraved we don't want anyone to know about it. It was so bad we don't want anyone to know about it. But we're kind of virtue signaling, hoodwinking. Whatever happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. As a good thing. And it's not a good thing. And I pray, Richard, you had a great time in Vegas. Maybe one day you could share how much money you lost on the fruit machines. When we looked at the picture of the Acrocorinth, the massive mountain, it's about 2,000 feet high, that overlooked the city, a wonderful natural fortress of defense for the city. This is where the goddess Athena was, goddess of fertility, sexuality, ritual temple prostitution, housing over 1,000 male and female temple prostitutes that would descend on the city every night to engage in sexual idolatrous activity. It's where we go, hello, sailor. That's the phrase. Whatever happens in Corinth, sailor, stays in Corinth. It would be enough to make a modern missionary clutch their pearls or reach for the smelling salts. It would be so terrifying to go there. Paul was entering the belly of the beast. That's why he went in fear and trembling. And he was going to Corinth to start a church of Jesus followers, not Jesus admirers, because Corinth had become this horrendous byword for idolatrous immorality. It was tough. Paul was afraid. The city was fabulously wealthy, but morally bankrupt. And he first meets the Jewish couple that had been expelled from Rome, Priscilla and Aquila, tent makers like Paul. We'll come to the details of the tent making later in the series. They had a lot in common. They were Jews. They had the same trade. They had previously lived in Rome, but Claudius had exiled them in AD 49 for reasons that we will come to again. So they moved to Corinth, Why? Because they could ply their tent-making trade in Corinth much better than in many other cities. And of course, this couple became tremendously significant in Paul's work. So by the time the cavalry arrived in Silas and Timothy, Paul was preaching the gospel to Corinthian Jews, chapter 18, verse 5 and 6. They had rejected his word, as was the pattern, as we see in Paul's missionary work, except one or two, including significant people like the ruler of the synagogue, Crispus, chapter 18, verse 8. And it's here, through Priscilla and Aquila and Crispus and one or two others, that the church was born. So Paul then leaves the Jews and the synagogue who'd rejected him, and he goes to work in the Gentiles, and more Corinthians are added to the church. Paul was there for 18 months. This was no joyride. This was no light-hearted missionary adventure. Paul would have been on full alert. I suspect culture shock set in. I suspect that maybe even depression set in. That's why God had to speak to him in a dream. Did you notice when the Acts 18 was read? God spoke to Paul in a dream. These are clues that tell us something significant was going on with Paul in his head. God said to him in verses 9 and 10, "Do not be afraid." Why? Because he was terrified. "Keep on speaking. Do not be silent." Why? Because he felt like giving up, that his words were going nowhere. God said, "For I am with you." Why did God say that? Because Paul felt abandoned. No one is going to harm you or attack you. Why did God say that to Paul? Because he felt under permanent threat of violence to his own self. And then God says something amazing, which should recall the story of Elijah in 1 Kings. Remember when he runs away from Jezebel? "I'm the only one left, God." And God says, "No, I've got 7,000 that haven't bowed the knee to Baal." This is what God said to Paul. "No one's going to harm or attack you because I have many people in this city." Many people that Paul hadn't even known or considered. It's amazing. God is always working beyond and outside the reach of our ministries. We are never, ever alone. We are never, ever abandoned. We are not forgotten. And God needs to remind us, and he does. So, this was not Athens, where he was asked if he would have 1 lump or 2 with his coffee. Here in Corinth, he was likely to be asked 1 punch or 2, 1 prostitute or 2. Everything in Corinth conspired against the moral laws of the universe. Everything seemed to betray humanity, decency, loyalty, trust, faith. Everything seemed to be so loveless, mechanical, disordered. And this would obviously set Paul's mind to work. When these were brought into the church, Paul had to say, "No, this is not the true nature of love. This is the true nature of love. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love does not envy." And he goes on in chapter 13. Okay, so to finish our introduction, just a very quick comment about the final 5 verses of Acts 8. Well, the final 5 verses, Acts 18, 12 to 17. Towards the end of his 18 months, Paul was facing relentless pressure from his Jewish brethren. And one reason that we can be certain of the dates in Acts, we know that Paul was there in AD 50 and 51, was because Gallio was the proconsul between 51 and 52 AD. We know this because an inscription has been found with Gallio's name on it and a date. So we know when this event took place. We know where it took place, in front of the judgment seat in the civic square, the judgment seat known as the Bema, B-E-M-A. And we saw that in the video, in the photos that I showed earlier. It's amazing. Gallio was not interested in the charges that were being brought against Paul and his team. So in their fury, the Jews, in their rage, took Paul's friend Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him. In full view of Gallio, a hardened, tough Roman lawmaker, politician, he took no notice. But remember that God had promised Paul wouldn't be beaten in Corinth. But that didn't apply to poor old Sosthenes. It must have been very painful for Paul to see his co-worker beaten by his own brethren. And this episode effectively concludes Paul's second missionary journey. That's Corinth in Acts. Do you recall the first letter of Paul that I preached when I first came to Taunton? It was 1 Thessalonians. Paul wrote that astonishing letter whilst in Corinth in fear and trembling. It was from Corinth that he wrote that letter. And Paul had written in chapter 3, verse 8 of 1 Thessalonians, "For we live, Thessalonians, if you are standing firm in the Lord." So as he left Corinth, he would now be applying that verse also to the Corinthian church. I apply that verse as pastor here to this church. I live if you are standing firm in the Lord, if you are standing firm in the faith. And that's true for every pastor, every missionary who's a church planter. We live if you're standing firm. So in very short time, the church at Corinth would be asking questions of Paul. What about this? 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 And it goes on. And these questions remained entrenched in Paul's mind, so he would have to write and respond to these questions and spill significant quantities of ink. It wouldn't be too long before he would say to his bruised and battered friend Sosthenes, "Get some parchment and get a good quill and write down my response." If you go to 1 Corinthians, Paul greets the church from Paul and Sosthenes. Sosthenes is the one that wrote 1 Corinthians. I want you to write a letter to these crazy kids at Corinth. And I'll talk about everything, so make sure you have good pens and good ink. And Paul would then start to shape the church by the gospel. He would talk about love. I'm going to finish with this. This is a 19th century poem. "Could we with ink the oceans fill, and were the skies of parchment made, and every stalk on earth a quill, and every person a scribe by trade, to write the love of God above, would drain the oceans dry. Nor could the scroll contain the whole, though stretched from sky to sky. O love of God, how rich and pure, how measureless and how strong. It shall forever endure the saints' and angels' song." No wonder Paul would write to this loveless, arrogant church, "Love never ends." He is shaping these people to be a gospel people, to follow Jesus and to not merely admire him. Amen. God bless you, church. I hope that has blessed you, encouraged you, fired you,